Book 5, Chapter 4 of War and Peace, Volume 2, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Elmer Maude. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 5, Chapter 4. Soon after this, there came into the dark chamber to fetch Pierre, not the reader, but Pierre's sponsor, Wilarski, whom he recognized by his voice. To fresh questions as to the firmness of his resolution, Pierre replied, "Yes, yes, I agree." And with a beaming childlike smile, his fat chest uncovered, stepping unevenly and timidly in one slippered and one booted foot, he advanced, while Wilarski held a sword to his bare chest. He was conducted from that room along passages that turned backwards and forwards, and was at last brought to the doors of the lodge. Wilarski coughed. He was answered by the Masonic knock with mallets. The doors opened before them. A bass voice, Pierre was still blindfolded, questioned him as to who he was, when and where he was born, and so on. Then he was again led somewhere, still blindfolded, and as they went along he was told allegories of the toils of his pilgrimage, of holy friendship, of the eternal architect of the universe, and of the courage with which he should endure toils and dangers. During these wanderings, Pierre noticed that he was spoken of now as the seeker, now as the sufferer, and now as the postulant, to the accompaniment of various knockings with mallets and swords. As he was being led up to some object, he noticed a hesitation and uncertainty among his conductors. He heard those around him disputing in whispers, and one of them insisting that he should be led along a certain carpet. After that, they took his right hand, placed it on something, and told him to hold a pair of compasses to his left breast with the other hand, and to repeat after someone who read aloud an oath of fidelity to the laws of the order. The candles were then extinguished, and some spirit lighted, as Pierre knew by the smell, and he was told that he would now see the lesser light. The bandage was taken off his eyes, and by the faint light of the burning spirit, Pierre, as in a dream, saw several men standing before him, wearing aprons like the Redders and holding swords in their hands pointed at his breast. Among them stood a man whose white shirt was stained with blood. On seeing this, Pierre moved forward with his breast toward the swords, meaning them to pierce it. But the swords were drawn back from him, and he was at once blindfolded again. "Now thou hast seen the lesser light," uttered a voice. Then the candles were relit, and he was told that he would see the full light. The bandage was again removed, and more than 10 voices said together, "Sic transit gloria mundi." Pierre gradually began to recover himself, and looked about at the room and at the people in it. Round a long table covered with black sat some 12 men in garments like those he had already seen. Some of them Pierre had met in Petersburg society. In the president's chair sat a young man he did not know, with a peculiar cross hanging from his neck. On his right sat the Italian abbé whom Pierre had met at Anna Pavlovna's 2 years before. There were also present a very distinguished dignitary and a Swiss who had formerly been a tutor at the Karagins. All maintained a solemn silence, listening to the words of the president, who held a mallet in his hand. Let into the wall was a star-shaped light. At one side of the table was a small carpet with various figures worked upon it. At the other was something resembling an altar on which lay a testament and a skull. Round it stood 7 large candlesticks like those used in churches. 2 of the brothers led Pierre up to the altar, placed his feet at right angles, and bade him lie down, saying that he must prostrate himself at the gates of the temple. "He must first receive the trowel," whispered one of the brothers. "Oh, hush, please," said another. Pierre, perplexed, looked round with his short-sighted eyes without obeying, and suddenly doubts arose in his mind. "Where am I? What am I doing? Aren't they laughing at me? Shan't I be ashamed to remember this?" But these doubts only lasted a moment. Pierre glanced at the serious faces of those around, remembered all he had already gone through, and realized that he could not stop halfway. He was aghast at his hesitation, and trying to arouse his former devotional feeling, prostrated himself before the gates of the temple. and really the feeling of devotion returned to him even more strongly than before. When he had lain there some time, he was told to get up, and a white leather apron, such as the others wore, was put upon him. He was given a trowel and 3 pairs of gloves, and then the Grand Master addressed him. He told him that he should try to do nothing to stain the whiteness of that apron, which symbolized strength and purity. Then of the unexplained trowel, he told him to toil with it to cleanse his own heart from vice, and indulgently to smooth with it the heart of his neighbor. As to the first pair of gloves, a man's, he said that Pierre could not know their meaning, but must keep them. The second pair of man's gloves he was to wear at the meetings, and finally, of the third, a pair of women's gloves, he said, "Dear brother, these woman's gloves are intended for you too. Give them to the woman whom you shall honor most of all. This gift will be a pledge of your purity of heart to her whom you select to be your worthy helpmeet in masonry." And after a pause he added, "But beware, dear brother, that these gloves do not deck hands that are unclean." While the Grand Master said these last words, it seemed to Pierre that he grew embarrassed. Pierre himself grew still more confused, blushed like a child till tears came to his eyes, began looking about him uneasily, and an awkward pause followed. This silence was broken by one of the brethren, who led Pierre up to the rug and began reading to him from a manuscript book an explanation of all the figures on it: the sun, the moon, a hammer, a plumb line, a trowel, a rough stone and a squared stone, a pillar, 3 windows, and so on. Then a place was assigned to Pierre. He was shown the signs of the lodge, told the password, and at last was permitted to sit down. The Grand Master began reading the statutes. They were very long, and Pierre, from joy, agitation, and embarrassment, was not in a state to understand what was being read. He managed to follow only the last words of the statutes, and these remained in his mind. "In our temples we recognize no other distinctions," read the Grand Master, "but those between virtue and vice. Beware of making any distinctions which may infringe equality. Fly to a brother's aid whoever he may be, exhort him who goeth astray, raise him that falleth, never bear malice or enmity toward thy brother. Be kindly and courteous. Kindle in all hearts the flame of virtue. Share thy happiness with thy neighbor, and may envy never dim the purity of that bliss. Forgive thy enemy, do not avenge thyself except by doing him good. Thus fulfilling the highest law thou shalt regain traces of the ancient dignity which thou hast lost." He finished, and getting up, embraced and kissed Pierre, who, with tears of joy in his eyes, looked round him, not knowing how to answer the congratulations and greetings from acquaintances that met him on all sides. He acknowledged no acquaintances, but saw in all these men only brothers, and burned with impatience to set to work with them. The Grand Master rapped with his mallet. All the masons sat down in their places, and one of them read an exhortation on the necessity of humility. The Grand Master proposed that the last duty should be performed, and the distinguished dignitary who bore the title of Collector of Alms went round to all the brothers. Pierre would have liked to subscribe all he had, but fearing that it might look like pride, subscribed the same amount as the others. The meeting was at an end, and on reaching home Pierre felt as if he had returned from a long journey on which he had spent dozens of years, had become completely changed, and had quite left behind his former habits and way of life. End of Book 5, Chapter 4. Book 5, Chapter 5 of War and Peace, Volume 2, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Elmer Maude. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 5, Chapter 5. The day after he had been received into the lodge, Pierre was sitting at home reading a book, and trying to fathom the significance of the square, one side of which symbolized God, another moral things, a third physical things, and the fourth a combination of these. Now and then his attention wandered from the book and the square, and he formed in imagination a new plan of life. On the previous evening at the lodge, he had heard that a rumor of his duel had reached the Emperor, and that it would be wiser for him to leave Petersburg. Pierre proposed going to his estates in the south and there attending to the welfare of his serfs. He was joyfully planning this new life when Prince Vasily suddenly entered the room. "My dear fellow, what have you been up to in Moscow? Why have you quarrelled with Elaine, mon cher? You are under a delusion," said Prince Vasily as he entered. "I know all about it, and I can tell you positively that Elaine is as innocent before you as Christ was before the Jews." Pierre was about to reply, but Prince Vasily interrupted him. "And why didn't you simply come straight to me as to a friend? I know all about it, and understand it all," he said. "You behaved as becomes a man who values his honor, perhaps too hastily, but we won't go into that. But consider the position in which you are placing her and me in the eyes of society, and even of the court," he added, lowering his voice. "She is living in Moscow, and you are here. Remember, dear boy," and he drew Pierre's arm downwards, "it is simply a misunderstanding. I expect you feel it so yourself. Let us write her a letter at once, and she'll come here and all will be explained, or else, my dear boy, let me tell you it's quite likely you'll have to suffer for it." Prince Vasily gave Pierre a significant look. "I know from reliable sources that the Dowager Empress is taking a keen interest in the whole affair. You know, she is very gracious to Elaine." Pierre tried several times to speak, but on one hand Prince Vasily did not let him, and on the other, Pierre himself feared to begin to speak in the tone of decided refusal and disagreement in which he had firmly resolved to answer his father-in-law. Moreover, the words of the Masonic statutes, "Be kindly and courteous," recurred to him. He blinked, went red, got up and sat down again, struggling with himself to do what was for him the most difficult thing in life, to say an unpleasant thing to a man's face, to say what the other, whoever he might be, did not expect. He was so used to submitting to Prince Vasily's tone of careless self-assurance that he felt he would be unable to withstand it now, but he also felt that on what he said now his future depended, whether he would follow the same old road, or that new path so attractively shown him by the Masons, on which he firmly believed he would be reborn to a new life. "Now, dear boy," said Prince Vasily playfully, "say yes, and I'll write to her myself, and we will kill the fatted calf." But before Prince Vasily had finished his playful speech, Pierre, without looking at him, and with a kind of fury that made him like his father, muttered in a whisper, "Prince, I did not ask you here. Go, please go." And he jumped up and opened the door for him. "Go," he repeated, amazed at himself and glad to see the look of confusion and fear that showed itself on Prince Vasily's face. "What's the matter with you? Are you ill?" "Go," the quivering voice repeated. And Prince Vasily had to go without receiving any explanation. A week later, Pierre, having taken leave of his new friends, the Masons, and leaving large sums of money with them for alms, went away to his estates. His new brethren gave him letters to the Kiev and Odessa Masons, and promised to write to him and guide him in his new activity. End of Book 5, Chapter 5. Book 5, Chapter 6 of War and Peace, Volume 2, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Elmer Maude. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 5, Chapter 6. The duel between Pierre and Dólokhov was hushed up, and in spite of the Emperor's severity regarding duels at that time, neither the principals nor their seconds suffered for it. But the story of the duel, confirmed by Pierre's rupture with his wife, was the talk of society. Pierre, who had been regarded with patronizing condescension when he was an illegitimate son, and petted and extolled when he was the best match in Russia, had sunk greatly in the esteem of society after his marriage, when the marriageable daughters and their mothers had nothing to hope from him, especially as he did not know how and did not wish to court society's favor. Now he alone was blamed for what had happened. He was said to be insanely jealous and subject, like his father, to fits of bloodthirsty rage. And when, after Pierre's departure, Elaine returned to Petersburg, she was received by all her acquaintances not only cordially, but even with a shade of deference due to her misfortune. When conversation turned on her husband, Elaine assumed a dignified expression, which, with characteristic tact, she had acquired, though she did not understand its significance. This expression suggested that she had resolved to endure her troubles uncomplainingly, and that her husband was a cross laid upon her by God. Prince Vasily expressed his opinion more openly. He shrugged his shoulders when Pierre was mentioned, and pointing to his forehead, remarked, "A bit touched. I always said so." "I said from the first," declared Anna Pavlovna, referring to Pierre. "I said at the time, and before anyone else," she insisted on her priority, that senseless young man was spoiled by the depraved ideas of these days. I said so even at the time when everybody was in raptures about him, when he had just returned from abroad, and when, if you remember, he posed as a sort of Marat at one of my soirees. And how has it ended? I was against this marriage even then, and foretold all that has happened." Anna Pavlovna continued to give on free evenings the same kind of soirees as before, such as she alone had the gift of arranging, at which she was to be found the cream of really good society, the bloom of the intellectual essence of Petersburg, as she herself put it. Besides this refined selection of society, Anna Pavlovna's receptions were also distinguished by the fact that she always presented some new and interesting person to the visitors, and that nowhere else was the state of the political thermometer of legitimate Petersburg court society so dearly and distinctly indicated. Toward the end of 1806, when all the sad details of Napoleon's destruction of the Prussian army at Jena and Auerstadt, and the surrender of most of the Prussian fortresses had been received, when our troops had already entered Prussia and our second war with Napoleon was beginning, Anna Pavlovna gave one of her soirees. The cream of really good society consisted of the fascinating Elaine, forsaken by her husband, Mortemart, the delightful Prince Hippolyte, who had just returned from Vienna, two diplomatists, the old aunt, a young man referred to in that drawing-room as a man of great merit, un homme de beaucoup de mérite, a newly appointed maid of honor and her mother, and several other less noteworthy persons. The novelty Anna Pavlovna was setting before her guests that evening was Boris Drubetskoy, who had just arrived as a special messenger from the Prussian army, and was aide-de-camp to a very important personage. The temperature shown by the political thermometer to the company that evening was this: whatever the European sovereigns and commanders may do to countenance Bonaparte, and to cause me, and us in general, annoyance and mortification, our opinion of Bonaparte cannot alter. We shall not cease to express our sincere views on that subject, and can only say to the King of Prussia and others, so much the worse for you. Tout l'a valu, Georges Dandin. That's all we have to say about it. When Boris, who was to be served up to the guests, entered the drawing-room, almost all the company had assembled, and the conversation, guided by Anna Pavlovna, was about our diplomatic relations with Austria and the hope of an alliance with her. Boris, grown more manly and looking fresh, rosy, and self-possessed, entered the drawing-room elegantly dressed in the uniform of an aide-de-camp, and was duly conducted to pay his respects to the aunt and then brought back to the general circle. Anna Pavlovna gave him her shriveled hand to kiss, and introduced him to several persons whom he did not know, giving him a whispered description of each. "Prince Hippolyte Karagan, charming young fellow. Monsieur Kronk, chargé d'affaires from Copenhagen, a profound intellect." And simply, "Mr. Shitov, a man of great merit." This of the man usually so described. Thanks to Anna Mikhailovna's efforts, his own tastes, and the peculiarities of his reserved nature, Boris had managed during his service to place himself very advantageously. He was aide-de-camp to a very important personage, had been sent on a very important mission to Prussia, and had just returned from there as a special messenger. He had become thoroughly conversant with that unwritten code with which he had been so pleased at Olmütz, and according to which an ensign might rank incomparably higher than a general, and according to which what was needed for success in the service was not effort or work or courage or perseverance, but only the knowledge of how to get on with those who can grant rewards, and he was himself often surprised at the rapidity of his success and at the inability of others to understand these things. In consequence of this discovery, his whole manner of life, all his relations with old friends, all his plans for his future were completely altered. He was not rich, but would spend his last groat to be better dressed than others, and would rather deprive himself of many pleasures than allow himself to be seen in a shabby equipage or appear in the streets of Petersburg in an old uniform. He made friends with and sought the acquaintance of only those above him in position, and who could therefore be of use to him. He liked Petersburg and despised Moscow. The remembrance of the Rostovs' house and of his childish love for Natasha was unpleasant to him, and he had not once been to see the Rostovs since the day of his departure for the army. To be in Anna Pavlovna's drawing-room he considered an important step up in the service, and he at once understood his role, letting his hostess make use of whatever interest he had to offer. He himself carefully scanned each face, appraising the possibilities of establishing intimacy with each of those present, and the advantages that might accrue. He took the seat indicated to him beside the fair Elaine, and listened to the general conversation. "Vienna considers the basis of the proposed treaty so unattainable that not even a continuity of most brilliant successes would secure them, and she doubts the means we have of gaining them. That is the actual phrase used by the Vienna cabinet," said the Danish chargé d'affaires. "The doubt is flattering," said the man of profound intellect with a subtle smile. "We must distinguish between the Vienna cabinet and the Emperor of Austria," said Montmartre. "The Emperor of Austria can never have thought of such a thing. It is only the cabinet that says it." "Ah, my dear Viscount," put in Anna Pavlovna, "l'Europe—" For some reason she called it Europe, as if that were a specially refined French pronunciation which she could allow herself when conversing with a Frenchman. "L'Europe ne sera jamais notre allié sincère." Europe will never be our sincere ally. After that, Anna Pavlovna led up to the courage and firmness of the King of Prussia, in order to draw Boris into the conversation. Boris listened attentively to each of the speakers, awaiting his turn, but managed meanwhile to look round repeatedly at his neighbor, the beautiful Elaine, whose eyes several times met those of the handsome young aide-de-camp with a smile. Speaking of the position of Prussia, Anna Pavlovna very naturally asked Boris to tell them about his journey to Glogau, and in what state he found the Prussian army. Boris, speaking with deliberation, told them in pure, correct French many interesting details about the armies and the court, carefully abstaining from expressing an opinion of his own about the facts he was recounting. For some time he engrossed the general attention, and Anna Pavlovna felt that the novelty she had served up was received with pleasure by all her visitors. The greatest attention of all to Boris' narrative was shown by Elaine. She asked him several questions about his journey, and seemed greatly interested in the state of the Prussian army. As soon as he had finished, she turned to him with her usual smile. "You absolutely must come and see me," she said in a tone that implied that, for certain considerations he could not know of, this was absolutely necessary. "On Tuesday between 8 and 9. It will give me great pleasure." Boris promised to fulfill her wish, and was about to begin a conversation with her when Anna Pavlovna called him away on the pretext that her aunt wished to hear him. "You know her husband, of course," said Anna Pavlovna, closing her eyes and indicating Elaine with a sorrowful gesture. "Ah, she is such an unfortunate and charming woman. Don't mention him before her. Please don't. It is too painful for her." End of Book 5, Chapter 6. Book 5, Chapter 7 of War and Peace, Volume 2, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Elmer Maude. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 5, Chapter 7. When Boris and Anna Pavlovna returned to the others, Prince Hippolyte had the ear of the company. Bending forward in his armchair, he said, "Le roi de Prusse," and having said this, laughed. Everyone turned toward him. "Le roi de Prusse?" Hippolyte said interrogatively, again laughing, and then calmly and seriously sat back in his chair. Anna Pavlovna waited for him to go on, but as he seemed quite decided to say no more, she began to tell of how at Potsdam the impious Bonaparte had stolen the sword of Frederick the Great. "It is the sword of Frederick the Great which she began, but Hippolyte interrupted her with the words, "Le roi de Prusse," and again, as soon as all turned toward him, excused himself and said no more. Anna Pavlovna frowned. Mortemart, Hippolyte's friend, addressed him firmly. "Come now, what about your roi de Prusse?" Hippolyte laughed, as if ashamed of laughing. "Oh, it is nothing. I only wish to say—" He wanted to repeat a joke he had heard in Vienna, and which he had been trying all that evening to get in. "I only wish to say that we are wrong to fight pour le roi de Prusse." Boris smiled circumspectly, so that it might be taken as ironical or appreciative according to the way the joke was received. Everybody laughed. "Your joke is too bad. It's witty, but unjust," said Anna Pavlovna, shaking her little shriveled finger at him. "We are not fighting pour le roi de Prusse, but for right principles. Oh, that wicked Prince Hippolyte," she said. The conversation did not flag all evening, and turned chiefly on the political news. It became particularly animated toward the end of the evening, when the rewards bestowed by the Emperor were mentioned. "You know, N.N. received a snuff-box with the portrait last year," said the man of profound intellect. "Why shouldn't S.S. get the same distinction?" "Pardon me, a snuff-box with the Emperor's portrait is a reward but not a distinction," said the diplomatist. "A gift, rather." "There are precedents. I may mention Schwarzenberg." "It is impossible," replied another. "Will you bet? The ribbon of the order is a different matter." When everybody rose to go, Elaine, who had spoken very little all the evening, again turned to Boris, asking him in a tone of caressing significant command to come to her on Tuesday. "It is of great importance to me," she said, turning with a smile toward Anna Pavlovna, and Anna Pavlovna, with the same sad smile with which she spoke of her exalted patroness, supported Elaine's wish. It seemed as if from some words Boris had spoken that evening about the Prussian army, Elaine had suddenly found it necessary to see him. She seemed to promise to explain that necessity to him when he came on Tuesday. But on Tuesday evening, having come to Elaine's splendid salon, Boris received no clear explanation of why it had been necessary for him to come. There were other guests, and the Countess talked little to him, and only as he kissed her hand on taking leave said unexpectedly and in a whisper, with a strangely unsmiling face, "Come to dinner tomorrow, in the evening. You must come. Come." During that stay in Petersburg, Boris became an intimate in the Countess' house. End of Book 5, Chapter 7.